happen if a pregnant woman was struck, causing her to give birth? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Exodus on walking through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Exodus chapter 21. We're going to be reading from verses 22 to 27. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Exodus 21, beginning at verse 22. If men fight and hurt a woman with child, so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished according as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judge has determined. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. The children of Israel are at Mount Sinai receiving the law of God, what sometimes is referred to as the law of Moses. God directly gave them what we call the Ten Commandments in chapter 20, but after the people were afraid to hear the voice of God directly, God called Moses away from the people to give them these judgments that we find in chapters 21 through 23. These judgments would be written down in the book of the covenant, showing us that they were part of the law of Moses just as much as the Ten Commandments were. In our last two episodes, we have talked about God's Old Testament laws concerning slaves and concerning violence. With the laws concerning violence, by today's standard, the punishment was extreme, capital punishment. Yet God had decreed in Genesis 9 verse 6 that if man sheds another man's blood, he deserved to die. This punishment would not be carried out by a private citizen, but by society itself in accordance with justice. Coming down to verse 22, we are going to deal with what would happen if violence fell upon a pregnant woman who then gave birth. In verse 22, we find that during the course of men fighting, a woman who is pregnant has been struck. Of course, we know that this could cause a woman to go into premature labor and give birth. That is what is being talked about here. It is premature birth. Some versions translate this verse to say, if a woman is hit and suffers a miscarriage, but no further harm comes to the woman, the man will be punished. Translating the verse in this way assumes that what is born is dead, something that is not necessarily true in the Hebrew, nor in this context. It also makes it seem that God places a lesser value on the child in the womb, a notion the rest of Scripture denies. Verse 22 is teaching that if a woman is struck and the child is born, but no harm comes to the woman or child, then he will be forced to pay a fine, consistent with the extent of the harm. There will be a cost that comes with a premature birth, even a healthy one, and the one who struck the woman would need to pay those costs. However, if harm does come to the mother or the child, then further punishment will be exacted by society up to and including death, if death is the result. Notice, however, in the context that it isn't the husband who pronounces judgment. It is a judge, someone entrusted with executing judgment. God never condoned vengeance, a teaching that Jesus had to correct in Matthew 5:38-42. This section on violence ends in verses 26 and 27 with what happens when a man strikes his male or female servants and permanently injures them. Earlier in the chapter, we've dealt with what was to happen if a master killed their slaves. It all depended how long after the event the slave died that would determine the penalty. Here we're not dealing with the death of the slave, but a permanent dismemberment. By using an eye or a tooth as examples, what we're really talking about here is any part of the body that's permanently injured as the result of a master striking a slave. Even though masters shouldn't mistreat their slaves, sometimes it was necessary if the slave was disobedient to strike the slave. However, this law, as with the one in the previous verses, should have the effect of restraining masters from going overboard because of the punishments that would come. If a master struck a free man, then retribution would be sought, and it would be consistent with the injury. However, the slave was not in a position to seek this type of relief, because then his master could theoretically treat the slave worse afterwards. That would leave the slave without justice. So if the master struck a slave and permanently injured them, the punishment to the master was that he would have to set the slave free. That would be a huge loss for the master, because not only would he lose the labor of the slave he struck, but in order to get another slave, he would have to purchase one. So this law not only gave justice to the slave in the event of permanent injury, but it protected them too, for a master wouldn't want to injure his slave lest he lose him. Again, we must realize that slavery wasn't commanded here, however, it was regulated. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Exodus chapter 21, verses 28 to 36, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
of his cross.